Welcome to our first lab activity. This is going to be the Circle Lab. If you are in Physics or in AP Physics 1, you are just going to record all of our notes for the lab and then your lab data in your regular physics notebook right underneath the question of the day. If you are in specifically my AP Physics C Mechanics class, when we come back to school in a couple of weeks for hybrid learning, I'm going to give you a physical lab notebook that'll be separate. For now, just to keep your lab stuff separate, what I'd like you to do is if your regular notebook looks like this, flip it over to the back, and then you can start taking your lab notes separate in the back of your notebook, so they're separate from your daily notes. But if you're in regular physics or AP Physics 1, just put them in your daily notes. So for our lab, the first thing we need to do is title our lab, so when we're looking back at this later, we know what our notes are about. And so this is going to be called the Circle Lab. And every lab should have a purpose. There should be something that we're trying to accomplish. For the Circle Lab, our purpose is that we are trying to experimentally determine the relationship between the diameter and circumference of a circle. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, Mr. Malm, I took geometry class. I already know what the relationship is. And that's great if you happen to remember. What we are trying to do, though, here is we're not trying to just write down what we've been taught it is, but to actually try to see if we can do our own experiment, make our own measurements, and actually come up with that relationship. And certainly that is what should happen in this lab. But the reason we're doing a lab where we know what the answer is supposed to be is because we need to develop our experimental techniques and our analysis skills where we know what the answer is supposed to look like. So when we start doing labs where we don't know what the answer is going to look like, that we can actually trust what we find and know that we did the analysis correctly. So for this lab, if you happen to remember what the equation is that connects this stuff, you're just going to pretend that you don't know what it is, and we're going to see if we can come up with that equation on our own just by making measurements. We should define some vocab quick. Certainly in any experiment, if there's any specific vocab that someone would need to know to understand the lab, you want to make sure you define that. And for this one, just so we are all clear on the measurements you need to make, I want to make sure we all know what the difference between diameter and circumference is. So the diameter is the length across the center of a circle. Whereas the circumference is the length got ahead of myself. Circumference is the length around the edge of a circle. In physics, we often use diagrams to help us communicate information. And in this case, we can actually use a diagram to maybe a little more clearly or concisely show what we mean by diameter and circumference. And so we'll practice doing that. For that, we're going to draw a circle. And then across the center. So at the widest point, right in the middle, that's the diameter. The circumference, if we wanted to measure that, we're going to go around the edge. So I'll start somewhere up on the edge, and I want to go all the way around until I come back to where I started. And that entire length is going to be my circumference. All right, so we need to measure a bunch of diameters and circumferences, so we have some numbers to work with, and then we're going to try to, using that experimental data, see if we can come up with the relationship, the equation connecting them. So to do that, we're going to need a data table. So I'm going to move over here. For our data table, we always organize scientific data when we're doing tables into columns. And so, we'll label this as our data table. And we are going to have a total of 3 columns. The first column is just going to describe what the object is that we're measuring. So at the top of our first column, we're going to give it a label, just call it object. Then we'll draw a vertical line to separate all of our columns. Since you know you have 5 objects that you collected yesterday, there should be a total of 5 lines underneath object. And then we need to measure the diameter. Anything that we measure, we want to include what unit we are using in the title in the column heading for our table. And so the unit we are going to measure in is going to be the number of lines on a piece of paper that our diameter or circumference is. And so that's why I had you collect a piece of lined paper to get ready for today. We're going to use this as our measuring device. And so our diameter is going to be measured in terms of how many lines our circle is wide. And then our last measurement that we need to make is the circumference. Again, in terms of how many lines wide it is. And then we'll just put a line under this to separate our column headings from our actual data. And then there should now be space to enter all of our information. Everything up to this point, remember anything that we write on the board, you would normally need to put in your notebook. And that's true up to here. I am going to start doing some sample data though with my own items. You are going to fill in your data table with your own items and your own measurements, so do not copy my measurements from this point forward. So my 5 objects, make it worse. I have good enough. I have a pen, I have a bottle cap, I have a tennis ball, I have a pop bottle, and I have a coffee can. And so I'm just going to write those down quick. Again, you would write your own items down. And then since we have 5 objects and 2 things we need to measure, diameter and circumference, there's going to be a total of 10 measurements that we make. And remember, you do need to actually measure all of these. You cannot use any equations that you might have learned in geometry to sort of cheat and get some shortcuts for some of them. We need to actually measure all of these. We're going to have 10 measurements we're going to make. So to do that, we need to set up our measuring device. So you're going to take your lined sheet of paper. And in order to make this a little easier to work with, the first thing we're going to do is just mark our first line as 0. And then we're going to number all the lines in a second. This is just so we don't have to always recount the lines for each measurement. So I'm going to put a 0 on my first line. That's where all my measurements are going to start. And then every 5 lines, I'm just going to write down how many lines we're at. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 would be line number 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more is 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more is 15. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more is 20. 1, 2, I only have 4 more lines, so I'm going to stop there, but you can go for as far as you have stuff, and then you should have a measuring device that looks like this. Now, For measuring diameters, those tend to be a little more straightforward. If I want to measure the diameter of my bottle cap, I'm just going to take my measuring device and measure from one edge to the other, right across the center, right at that widest part. And I don't know if I can get this to show up on the camera. The end of the bottle cap is not quite at line number 5. It's in between 4 and 5, a little closer to the 5. I don't want to just round to 5. I want to write down the most precise measurement I can. And so I'm going to look at that, and I think that's about 4.8. So for my bottle cap, I'm going to write down 4.8. So it's 4.8 lines wide. I don't need to write lines because I already wrote it in the column heading. So that's why we write it up there, so we don't have to keep writing it again and again and again. Some objects might be a little bit harder to measure the circumference of. The tennis ball, for example. Some of you might be able to do this, but if you have a sphere like this, trying to figure out how exactly to line your measuring device up can be really hard. And so a trick you can do there is if you have just a couple objects that goes just vertical, just go straight up and down, I can take and put the tennis ball in between them, make sure this is exactly the distance between the cans is the same as the diameter of the tennis ball. And then I can just take my measuring device and measure between these two, and that's a little bit easier to do. So that's going to be, it's not quite 10, 9.7, I think. So for my tennis ball, my diameter is going to be 9.7. And so you'll figure out how to measure the diameter of all of your stuff. You might have to be creative, but figure out a way to do it. And then for the circumference, same idea. I want to measure how far it is around it. Again, I want to actually measure this. No calculating, you have to actually measure it. If we've got something smaller, like the pen, that's pretty easy to do. I can just take the paper and wrap it around and see at what line I come back to my 0. And so that's just about exactly on the 4 line. So I'm going to call that 4.0. So I know that I was right on the line. My pen is 4.0 lines around. And then let's do the coffee can. So if I want to measure around this, if I take my measuring device, I have a problem. It is not long enough to go around it. And so you have a few options for what you can do in something like this. One thing you could do is if you have some tape and a scissors, you could take several pieces of paper and make a longer measuring device. Just make sure that your lines are lined up. And then you could wrap this all the way around it. If you don't want to do that or you don't have access to tape or whatever, not a problem. Another way that you could deal with it is we can sort of roll this along the table and measure its circumference that way. What I'm going to do is I need to find a spot on here that I can easily identify. And so I'm going to take a marker and mark this, so hopefully it shows up on the camera. But if you just have whatever your object is, if there's a little spot on it or a little label or something, you can just look at that. And then we need to somehow mark where we're starting. And so I'm going to get that mark right down at the bottom. Mark exactly where my mark is starting. I'm using a Post-it note, which I think is easy, but if you don't have Post-it notes, you could even just take a pencil and point it directly at where you're starting. And that works just as well. Then, starting with my mark right there, I'm just going to take and roll this around once. So I'm going to keep on rolling until my mark is back at the bottom. And then I'm going to mark that again. So I'll stick a Post-it note there. But again, if you don't have a Post-it note, just stick a pencil or something there so you can see where the other end of it is. And now, since we've rolled out the entire edge along the table, if we measure between these 2 points, that should be our circumference. And so certainly if you have a longer measuring device, that's enough that you can just go between them. But if you've just got the shorter one, not a problem. I'm just going to see how many lines it is total. So I've got 20 lines on my device, and so 20 gets me to right here. And so find some way to just sort of mark where you're going from. I got 20. Again, pencil, Post-it, whatever works for you. And then it's going to be 20 more. And 20 more, so that's 60 so far. And then another 17.6, it looks like. So 60 plus 17.6 more, that's going to be 77.6 lines for the circumference of my coffee can. So that's 4 of my 10 measurements. You'll need to actually, so that is 4 of my 10 measurements. You would need to actually do all 10, obviously. Remember, you have to actually measure the diameter and actually measure the circumference for each object. You cannot use any equations to figure out one from the other. You have to measure both of them. So 10 measurements that you're going to make for today.